I'm so ready for this. Are you?
I think I bruised my tailbone.
You bruised your tailbone?
Yeah, well...
How'd you do this, Dany?
Because, it's been wet in Seattle.
Yeah, it's an understatement.
I had to walk up to the pharmacy to grab medication refill. And, on the sidewalk outside my building, they have those there's that inlaid tile strip going down the sidewalk.
Oh, yeah, the really fancy stuff that helps the blind navigate. Yep, that stuff.
That is so slippery when wet.
It is?
Yeah.
That's not good.
No, it's not. So I was walking down the sidewalk and there was someone who was taking up the entire sidewalk. So I stepped to the side of them and stepped on that tile, slipped and fell.
No.
And bruised.
You did?
I think I bruised my tailbone. So.
Ow.
Welcome to .fm.
How's that related to everything that comes into this?
It's not. It's not really.
I thought you were going to tie this into the AIDS and be and no one helped me or something and be this is the AIDS crisis, an analogy for the AIDS crisis.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Incoming broadcast. You're listening to .fm.
Welcome to .fm. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
And today we're wrapping up our mini-series on the AIDS crisis by talking about ACT UP. In order to talk about and understand ACT UP, we need to start with one man, Larry Kramer.
One man. One era.
What are you, a movie trailer from the 90s?
Yeah, absolutely I am. Let's talk about Larry Kramer.
Larry Kramer, if you do any kind of research into the AIDS crisis and how the queer community was impacted and organized through the crisis, you'll see a lot of names coming up time and time again, like Peter Staley and others, but there's one name that seems to show up more than any other, at least from what I saw.
One name, Larry Kramer. Nice.
Now, Larry Kramer was a Jewish playwright and author, and eventually a bit of a journalist and an activist for the gay rights and AIDS movements. So
cool.
In the 1970s, Larry lived outside of New York City on Fire Island. Are you familiar with Fire Island at all?
Vaguely.
Yeah, same here. I don't know a ton about it, but Fire Island is really well known for and has been known since the 60s for a really vibrant and, flamboyant and inclusive queer community.
Let's go there.
Right? So, and I think even today they're one of the number one places for queer tourism in the States. But Larry lived on Fire Island. He was pretty active in the local queer community there. And in 1978, he published a novel. And this doesn't really have anything to do with the AIDS crisis itself, but it does sort of speak a little bit to who Larry was. And I guess it does kind of impact some of his later work. But he writes this novel it's fictional, but it's sort of semi-autobiographical about Larry's, experience in the gay community in the 70s. And he wrote it, after talking with a bunch of other gay men and friends that he, knew and were part of the community. And the novel is called Faggots.
That's strong.
It is
That's
strong.
a good way to get attention,
It sure is.
Yep.
And it didn't really go over well with most people, even in the queer community.
The novel or the name of the novel?
The novel itself.
Okay.
Critics panned it for its portrayal of very promiscuous gay sex and, rampant recreational drug use. And the gay community kind of panned it for sort of playing into gay stereotypes and stuff.
Got it.
And, later, when asked about the novel and writing it, Larry talked about how when he was interviewing, friends and community members about their experiences while writing the book, he would frequently be asked, is this a negative book or a positive book? And that, always kind of struck Kramer as interesting.
Sure.
And then later when the book came out, he's quoted as saying, the straight world thought I was repulsive and the gay world treated me like a traitor.
Wow. What?
Would literally turn their back when I walked by. I think people were guilty about all the promiscuity and all the partying they were doing.
People were guilty? That's what he said? People were guilty?
Yeah.
Or did he mean like people felt guilty or were they just jealous of his like flamboyant, beautiful lifestyle?
Well, no, I think it was because the other gay men that he spoke to and interviewed when writing this book, they would detail a lot of their, like their nightlife, doing drugs and partying and everything. But then when the book came out, they were like, oh, that's playing into stereotypes and, it's too much. And Larry sort of felt like that was a disconnect there. Like, well, but that's sort of what you told me, and it's what I also experienced. But now you're like, it's too much. Like, he attributed that sort of disconnect to kind of a guilt. Like, we like to party, but we don't like anyone to know about it, kind of thing. And his crime was telling
internalized
the truth.
Shame of some sorts.
Yeah.
Okay.
That. Anyway, the novel itself, while it is an important novel and it eventually became like one of the best-selling gay novels of all time and is, in fact, it's frequently used in like gay studies courses in college as like required reading.
Nice.
So it's definitely on my reading list at some point.
Yep.
But while the novel isn't crazy important for the context of this particular story, knowing that it exists is important, which is why I bring it up.
Okay.
Prior to the 1980s, Larry didn't really have a desire to get politically involved. He's quoted as saying political activism was not chic. It was not something you could brag about with your friends. Guys marching down Fifth Avenue was this whole other world. The whole gestalt of Fire Island was about beauty and looks and golden men,
And this dude was born in 1935 too. Mm-hmm. And so, you're saying like before the 1980s. Yeah, he's like what? Like 30, 40, almost 50 years old here. He's almost 50 years old here.
Yeah, he was in his 40s around this time.
Yeah. And like, so this isn't some young whippersnapper who's like, got other things going on or whatever. Like this is a mature man who's lived a long life, and all of a sudden he pivots.
And we joke now, and I think the AIDS crisis is a big part of why we joke about this. We joke now in the queer community that like once you hit like 35, you're a community elder. I have been described as a community elder. Not frequently, but like once or twice someone has told me I'm like a community elder at this point.
Dany the mother.
And I think a big part of that is because, there were so many who died in the AIDS crisis that we don't have a lot of elders. That like it says something that 35 years old is old for the community.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think that there was still something to that prior to this point. At this time where Larry was alive, where being in your mid 40s, he was kind of a community elder of sorts. But yeah, Larry didn't really want to get involved politically. He didn't really have that drive or that interest. But in the years leading up to 1981, a lot of Larry's friends in the community started coming down with this mysterious and severe illness, and it was something that couldn't really be ignored. And so that kind of prompted Larry to slowly become more and more involved in advocacy until in August of 1981, he invited what he called the A-list group of gay men from the New York City area to his apartment on Fire Island. He invited them all to come speak to or listen to this doctor who was speaking about all of their friends who were getting sick. And, this doctor told them that their friends' illnesses, they're all related, and that more research needed to be done. So over subsequent months, they continued to meet and discuss ways to raise money for that kind of research. And, they would discuss the inaction and dismissal of both local and federal governments, but especially local governments of New York, until 1982, when they officially formed the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which we talked about last episode.
We did.
And the GMHC, quickly became like the primary organization to raise funds and provide services for people suffering from AIDS in the New York area. Larry's already kind of getting thrust into, kind of a prominent leadership position of sorts already. But he started to become increasingly frustrated with the GMHC because they were really focused on the social services aspect for those who were dying. And Kramer really wanted to take more direct action, loudly pressure the government to do something. Mainly at this point in time, he really wanted to pressure New York City government to provide official municipal funding for the crisis.
Go Larry.
In early 1983, doctors in the medical community began officially recommending that men, and especially gay men, abstain from sex to try and prevent the spread of the disease.
I'm sure that advice came across well.
Yeah, it didn't go so well for the queer community. A lot of folks in the queer community felt like that was
cop out.
Well, no, what they felt like it was tamping down on their personal freedoms, and kind of similar to, and this is my interpretation, but kind of similar to how during COVID, when doctors were like, wear a mask to try and prevent the spread. And a lot of conservatives were like, no, that's infringing on my personal freedoms. Kind of the same thing. But Larry really wanted the Gay Men's Health Crisis to help spread that message and use their platform to, get it out to as many gay men as possible. The Gay Men's Health Crisis, a lot of the others on the board they disagreed with Larry and felt, like it was a slippery slope to infringing on personal freedoms. And so they refused to do that. So in response to GMHC not sharing, the message that doctors were recommending, he wrote this 5,000 word essay titled 1,112 and Counting.
Damn.
And he submitted it to the New York Native Gay newspaper. And they published the essay in March of 1983. And this is it's a really powerful, really potent essay. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but I highly recommend that, all our listeners look it up and read it because it's very powerful. But the essay starts like this. If this article doesn't scare the shit out of you, we're in real trouble. If this article doesn't rouse you to anger, fury, rage, and action, then gay men may have no future on this earth.
Oh, wow.
Our continued existence depends on just how angry you can get. So really kind of fiery essay. In fact, Michael Spector, he's a public health journalist for the New Yorker since 1998. He, looking back on this essay, he later wrote that it was a 5,000 word screed, this really fiery essay. And the essay accused basically everybody connected to the American healthcare system of refusing to acknowledge the implications of the growing AIDS epidemic and just kind of ignoring it entirely. Everyone from CDC officials, NIH researchers, local doctors, politicians, and especially local politicians like New York City Mayor Ed Koch. But the article's most scathing condemnation, the most, powerful and fiery condemnation, was for the members of the gay community that kind of seemed to just refuse to do anything and bury their head in the sand. The ones that just sort of seemed to think that if they ignored the disease, it would quietly go away. The ones that were trying to, put a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage, to use Dr. Fauci's language. Obviously, this essay, it had a really important impact. And there were a lot of people who would later, cite the essay as really opening their eyes and changing their life. But there were also a lot of people that didn't take the same message from it.
Well, yeah.
You know, there were a lot of gay men, especially the ones that were turned off by the novel Faggots that Larry had written years earlier.
Yeah.
They were the ones who, you know, they tried to downplay this essay by calling it alarmist and that it was displaying negative attitudes towards sex. There's a contemporary playwright and theater critic named Robert Chesley. Mm-hmm. He responded to the article by saying, if you read anything by Kramer closely, I think you'll find that the subtext is always the wages of gay sin are death. So they were trying to paint Larry as like a self-shaming.
Jesus, this is a dude that's like actively stepping up and like trying to rally the troops and, you know, do something about this whole AIDS crisis. And yet the gay community, there's portions of the gay community that are turning on him. And it's like, yeah, it's a really scary time.
Right.
But the best way to make change is to step up, speak up, and take action.
Yes. Yeah, it absolutely is. But there is sort of a double-edged sword to Larry's controversial style. On the one hand, it was great in that he was able to earn attention for the issue of AIDS in New York in a way that no one else had previously seemed able to do. But on the other hand, it kind of created this reputation around Larry that he was this alarmist, crazy man, you know? And that didn't necessarily ingratiate him into the people in power. But nonetheless, he continued to very loudly and publicly confront public figures and those who are in power. You know, there's a moment where he threw a drink in the face of a Republican fundraiser, Terry Dolan.
Hell yeah.
He publicly called Ed Koch and the New York media and government agencies equal to murderers.
Oh, let's go.
And this type of activism, you know, was something that Larry continued to do for the rest of his life, including, you know, many years later, when he wrote a open letter to Dr. Fauci in the San Francisco Chronicle. And in that letter, he called Dr. Fauci a murderer.
What?
You know, Larry, he was a bit of a firebrand, but definitely a firebrand that's sort of an inspiration. You know, you and I are...
Dany, you got a quick temper. Like, if there's something that gets you off, it doesn't take you long to suddenly go from like 0 to 100 and like you're standing up on your pedestal and you're shouting from the rooftops and you're like, I'm gonna change this and do this thing. It's really admirable, actually.
I don't have a quick temper. I can keep things in control fairly well, but I can get passionate, fired up, and on a soapbox.
Yes, you can.
That's true.
It's quite the sight to witness, viewer.
You and I are relatively active in the queer community here in Seattle, and you and I have butt heads at times about
of course we have
the correct way to address certain public issues, and I think you know there are times where I, you know, take a similar approach to Larry when it comes to what's practical and what is going to be a more strategic thing to do for the movement in the long run, rather than what do I do right this second in the moment, right? And so I think that's something that's really admirable about Larry as well. There's another Jewish gay playwright and a Pulitzer Prize drama winner, Tony Kushner. He later, kind of reminiscing about Larry, talks about why he thinks Larry fought so relentlessly. And he says, in a way, like a lot of Jewish men of Larry's generation, the Holocaust is a defining historical moment. And what happened in the early 1980s with AIDS felt and was, in fact, Holocaustal to Larry. This is deeply kind of personal, and I think it really sort of hits very close to home for Larry, not just because it's killing his friends, but it's also like the government response is very reminiscent to something that like his family experienced in Europe.
Right.
But eventually in 1983, so just a couple years after the GMHC is founded, the GMHC kind of deems that Larry's tactics are a little too militant for the group, and they sort of force him out of the organization and off the board.
That's a blow.
Yeah, and that really kind of, you know, I think it caught Larry by surprise, and it hit him pretty hard. So Larry ends up taking this extended trip to Europe. And while he's there, he visits the Dachau concentration camp and is surprised to learn that Dachau, a lot of the concentration camps, but Dachau especially, opened a lot earlier than I think most people think that they did. You know, I think a lot of people think that concentration camps and Jewish internment happened in like the final stages of World War II. But that's not true. The mass killing of Jewish people, like with gas chambers and stuff, that happened later, in the later stages of World War II. But the actual rounding up and internment and all of that happened pretty much from the beginning. Dachau opened in 1933, and yet Germans and, you know, pretty much no other country did anything to stop it. And that, I think, really resonated with Larry in kind of a way that, like, the AIDS crisis is sort of echoing history, that the government is just letting people die in this silent massacre and no one's really doing anything about it. So this sort of inspires him to write a new play that he called The Normal Heart. And this play is about a writer who nurses his partner who's dying from an unnamed disease. And also, while he's doing that, he's working with an activist organization who becomes, you know, angered and upset by the bad publicity that his activism is generating. So the organization kicks him out. It's kind of it's autobiographical.
It's an homage.
It's a play about Larry's experience with the gay men's health crisis. And the play debuts in 1985, and it is kind of instantly a literary landmark.
It's a classic. So generally, Larry is this guy, random dude, you know, hanging out on Fire Island, having a good time, writing books. The AIDS crisis comes around and
Friends
he gets pissed. Yep, he gets pissed, and all of a sudden he goes and starts his political and his activist career, and now he's getting kicked out of groups because he's becoming too passionate. He's highly passionate about these issues and doing everything he can to bring attention to this matter. And he's now like at the highs of his career, at the same time dealing with these, you know, massive political and frankly global issues with the HIV/AIDS crisis. Where's Larry going now? What's happening?
Well, for a few years between 1983 and 1987, Larry, you know, he takes that Europe trip, he writes this new play, and he continues to just try and spread awareness about the AIDS crisis where he can. But I think he's also kind of learning that, like, he wants to do the direct action kind of activism, you know, make a scene. But he also, I think, knows that, like, it is important for organizations like the Gay Men's Health Crisis that is doing these social services to exist. But they can't be the only type of organization that exists. So in March of 1987, Kramer he's asked to attend a meeting at the Lesbian and Gay Community Services Center in New York City.
1987.
And he's asked to speak on what the community can do in terms of action to fight AIDS. And it's a very well-attended speech. He, you know, reiterates a lot of what he wrote in 1112 and Counting. And during the speech, he decries the gay men's health crisis and a lot of other organizations as kind of politically impotent.
I love that.
Doing important work, but politically impotent and not really swaying the people in power.
That's like a low blow. It's so good.
And so he asked the audience publicly, do we want to start a new organization devoted to political action? And the answer is this resounding and emphatic
hell
yes.
Yeah.
So 2 days later, on March 12th, 300 people meet with Kramer.
300 people?
And they officially found the AIDS Coalition to unleash power. Or...
Oh, yeah. Act up! Hey, viewer. .fem exists because listeners like you believe in queer stories, trans joy, and radical community. If that sounds like your vibe, join us at patreon.com/.fem. Your support means the world. That's patreon.com/DOTFEMME.
Reacquiring signal.
Sorry, I was astonished that 300 people are like the people who are forming this. What do we call it? Union? I don't know.
A community organization, and it was pretty large to start with. Like you said, 300 people.
That's huge.
And ACT UP was organized as effectively leaderless. Larry wanted to make sure that it was democratic, as he describes it, democratic to a fault. And I think that we see that later on. Yeah. He doesn't want like one person to be in charge.
Everyone's equal.
They form it, without a formal organization plan. Originally, I don't think it was like officially incorporated or anything. But, it did have kind of a formal structure in the form of initially 2 committees and then later 3. The 2 main committees were the Issues Committee and the Actions Committee. And the Issues Committee meticulously studied the issues surrounding the particular advancements and goals that ACT UP wanted to achieve and accomplish. They were the ones that came up with the goals, set the goals, and really studied, what social and political issues are in the way. What do we have to do? And then the Actions Committee would plan public demonstrations that they called ZAPs to achieve those goals.
Cool.
But in addition to these committees, there were also caucuses and affinity groups, which, were slightly more specialized subgroups that were intended to create space for particular sub-communities in the organization, because they wanted to pursue specific goals to those communities' needs. So there were, like the Women's Caucus, and there was a Latina caucus, just as to name a couple, for example.
Yeah.
And then later on, I think a year later in like 1989 or 1988, there was a third committee that they created called the Treatment and Data Committee. And that one was formed to sort of study and analyze the existing treatments and research around the disease and create recommendations for, that ACT UP could officially recommend to governments and medical organizations, such as their big one, the National AIDS Treatment Research Agenda. And, the Treatment and Data Committee, actually, they presented their National AIDS Treatment Research Agenda to the medical community at the 5th International AIDS Conference, which was held in Montreal in 1989. ACT UP was not invited to this conference. They kind of forced their way in during the opening ceremony.
Nice. One of their zaps.
Yeah, it was a bit of a kind of an informal zap.
Yeah.
And this plan was so well sort of researched that it surprised and literally just wowed a lot of the medical professionals in attendance there.
Good.
And a lot of the medical professionals that were there actually joined ACT UP because of it.
Excellent.
That was 1989. Jumping back to ACT UP's earliest years in 87, ACT UP's very first target was the FDA. And, Kramer accused the FDA of neglecting a lot of, needed medications for AIDS treatment. So the primary goal for this first ZAP was civil disobedience, that, they wanted it to result in as many people as possible being arrested, because that would focus attention on the target, on, the issue at hand. Mm-hmm. On March 24th, 1987, 250 participants showed up on Wall Street to publicly blockade the FDA's Wall Street offices, during which 17 people were arrested for blocking rush hour traffic. So not too shabby for a first ZAP.
Yeah.
It definitely made waves, but I think they really gained attention a few months later in October of 1987, when they made their national debut at the Second National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. Hundreds of thousands of people marching on Washington, but ACT UP was present. They were a very active and visible presence.
Excellent.
For both the march and the main rally that day, as well as they held a large civil disobedience demonstration, a huge ZAP, on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court building the following day. And it was this national visibility that, like, they were in national news at this point. And it really, it inspired a lot of the other participants of the march to go back home and spin up their own local ACT UP chapters across the country.
So trying to get an idea of just how widespread ACT UP is becoming. Like, the little research I have here shows like 10,000 people maybe are a part of ACT UP. This is like, that's a huge number for an activist organization like this. But it is like, it seems like they're doing a lot and they're doing a lot frequently, which requires a lot of manpower.
Right. ACT UP was constantly doing, zaps and demonstrations. We're talking about just the US, but there were ACT UP chapters in Paris.
Wow.
They still ACT UP, still affiliated, but they had kind of, a different sort of French flair to them. And there were ACT UP chapters in London and Belgium, like all over the world. ACT UP was by like 1989, ACT UP was like a global organization that had like hundreds of thousands of members.
Whoa. Okay.
In October of 1988, ACT UP actually performed one of their most successful demonstrations that was called Seize the FDA. It was a zap called Seize the FDA, where they successfully shut down the Food and Drug Administration for a whole day. And they did this by blocking doors, walkways, roads. It was the largest public demonstration since the Vietnam War, since public demonstrations against the Vietnam War. There were between 1,100 and 1,500 HIV positive patients, all chanting, "Hey, hey, FDA, how many people have you killed today?" As well as shouting, "We are the experts, let us in." And at this zap, ACT UP presented very precise and specific demands for actionable changes to make experimental drugs available more quickly and more fairly. And, this really kind of demonstrated that they had this thorough knowledge of the FDA approval process. Treatment and Data Committee is really coming in clutch here. They are on top of it. They know the process in and out.
Awesome.
The FDA administration officials can't just say, "Oh, well, it's not that simple." Bitch, they know it's not that simple. That's why they're giving you actionable steps you can do. Really impressive stuff. And it was this demonstration that over the course of the next year resulted in both the FDA and the NIH to start including AIDS activists in policymakers' active decision making and actively asking for their input.
Good.
So the gay community went from trying to be listened to becoming provocative, iconoclastic, disruptive, and theatrical. And when they gained the attention, as I mentioned, one of the best things that I've ever done in my life was to not be put aback by the disruption the way the overwhelming majority of the scientific community was, but to listen to what these people were saying. And when I listened to what they were saying was making absolutely perfect sense. And I said to myself, if I were in their shoes, I would be doing exactly what they were doing. And I invited them in to our meetings, to our discussions. I made them part of the strategic approach to how we were going to try and solve this problem. And their input was invaluable.
And then in 1989, ACT UP meets with the head of Burroughs Wellcome. That was the drug manufacturing company that patented AZT and set the price at $10,000.
Oh, right.
While they're at this meeting, the leadership of ACT UP gets to meet with some of the heads of Burroughs Wellcome. And these heads, these executives, are so disgustingly dismissive. They basically just tell ACT UP that they should just be happy that the drugs are priced at $10,000 because it would allow the company to have more money to continue AIDS research.
Dismissive is a common thread during this time period.
100%.
That's frustrating.
And that's mind-bogglingly stupid. Because what does it matter? What does it matter if you can do more research on AIDS if everyone that research would help is dead by the time you find it?
Right.
But thankfully, because of this, ACT UP demonstrates, they have this massive zap, this huge boycott that completely shut down Wall Street. They majorly affected the economy, and this huge zap ended up resulting in Burroughs Wellcome lowering the price of AZT from $10,000 to $6,400 per year just 3 days later, which is still very expensive, but it's not that's not nothing.
Right.
Still a major win for them.
Yeah.
But then we get to 1991, which was a huge year for ACT UP. There were so many zaps that happened, but I have three of my favorites right here. So in January of 91, ACT UP activists led by a member named John Weir entered the CBS Evening News studio during their broadcast while they were covering the first Gulf War crisis. And at the beginning of their broadcast, they sort of broke into the studio. They jumped in front of the camera and started shouting, "AIDS is news, fight AIDS, not Arabs."
Hell yeah.
And, forced the control room to cut to commercial.
Oh my God.
And I believe there's footage of that zap on YouTube somewhere.
Oh, I want to find it.
There were similar zaps that happened across the country where, people were breaking into TV studios doing very similar things, or like radio studios taking over the microphone. There was one that happened at like Grand Central Station where they put up a bunch of banners that covered up the train schedules, at the station. So like people are going to be looking at the schedules to figure out where their train is and what are they going to see? A message about, AIDS. So it was a pretty notable coordinated demonstration that they called Day of Desperation. Another one I think is just absolutely great. In September of 91, ACT UP New York members led by an activist, Peter Staley, who I believe I've mentioned him before, they wrapped Senator Jesse Helms' Arlington home in a 15-foot inflatable condom that read "A condom to prevent unsafe politics" in order to protest Jesse Helms' AIDS amendments.
Excellent.
Incredibly excellent. Another one that's also my favorite, and I think just because it's from Seattle, was in December, members of ACT UP Seattle distributed safer sex packets that had, condoms and stuff in it. But they also contained a photographically illustrated pamphlet titled "How to Fuck Safely" that had like photographs of two guys and this caused Washington state legislature to pass a harmful to minors law that made it illegal to distribute sexually explicit material to minors, which okay, yeah, I mean, probably shouldn't distribute straight up porn to high schoolers. But
yeah, I'm on that. Yeah.
But I think they did have a point that effective sex education is important, not just for the queer community, but
especially
for,
in the early 90s.
Too.
Right. In the early 90s.
What about right now? We still don't have that bullshit.
I know.
So,
I know. It's still just a chapter in a textbook.
Yeah. So ACT UP Seattle was, they were wild.
Yeah.
I think ACT UP's most powerful zap, however, or at least the one that you can, I watched footage of it and it literally brought me to tears. Sunday, October 11th, 1992. At 1:00 in the afternoon, they held a march to the White House, and there were hundreds of people in attendance, but 300 of those were carrying small boxes and containers.
No.
And these small boxes had the ashes of loved ones who had died from AIDS.
Wow.
And remember, there were a lot of people who died from AIDS at this time who were not allowed to have funerals because funeral homes wouldn't, handle the bodies of people who died from AIDS oftentimes. Or, they refused to do it on moral grounds, assuming, some kind of moral defect that led to them getting AIDS, which is crazy. So a lot of the folks that died were cremated. They didn't have headstones or public plots that their families could visit. So a lot of participants, they took these boxes of their loved ones' ashes and they marched up Pennsylvania Avenue to the fence in front of the White House lawn. And they took turns giving speeches and eulogies and then climbing up to the top of the fence, leaning over and dumping the ashes of their loved ones on the White House lawn in what they called a political funeral. It's incredibly moving.
Wow.
I think it really was, I think their most powerful zap, maybe not most successful in terms of changing public policy, but definitely the most powerful and emotionally charged.
Yeah.
I think, however, ACT UP is probably most famously recognized for their imagery and their marketing prowess. I mean, I'm sure when you think of like the AIDS crisis or AIDS rights, you probably think of that poster that's the pink triangle on the black background, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that is from ACT UP's Silence Equals Death campaign. And they had that wasn't the only poster as part of their campaign, but this one poster is probably their most well known. And it was originally created in 1986, so before ACT UP was even formed, by the Silence Equals Death Project, which was this 6-person, they called themselves a consciousness raising collective in New York. And they had the idea to create this collective and design this poster after an American conservative writer and political commentator named William F. Buckley Jr., which is the whitest name I can think of.
That's right.
He publicly on TV called for HIV positive individuals to be tattooed so that they could be easily recognized. And that is some Holocaust shit.
Yes, it is.
So these 6 guys decided they wanted to design a poster that they could wheat paste all over New York City. And specifically, they wanted to design something without any kind of photographic imagery because they didn't want to be, exclusionary in any possible way. So they decided to make it very abstract. So the poster they designed simply has the name of their group on the bottom, Silence Equals Death, and there's a pink triangle, which, at the time, and I mean even still today, but at the time was known for its association with the persecution of gay folks in Nazi Germany 4 decades earlier, all on a black field against a black background. And the posters first, they had their first printing and hit the streets in March 1987, right as ACT UP was being formed. And later, a few months to a year later, ACT UP asked the collective if they could have the rights to the design, and the collective said yes. And so they gave the rights to the design to ACT UP, and ACT UP reprinted it as part of their, central Silence Equals Death campaign. And really, because of ACT UP, pink triangle and the phrase Silence Equals Death has sort of become synonymous with AIDS advocacy and awareness.
I think it's about time we start posting the pink triangle around town again.
I think so. And I've started to actually see it come up more in downtown Seattle. It's starting to come back. So around this time, however, in the early 90s, there started to be some sort of schism kind of forming within the membership of ACT UP. As ACT UP was becoming more successful and they were working more and more with government agencies and drug companies, the Treatment and Data Committee was becoming more technical and sophisticated, and that sort of made the general membership a little uncomfortable. Because they still saw government agencies and the drug companies as adversaries, and so the fact that Treatment and Data Committee was kind of becoming closer to them, they were worried that they were getting a little too chummy, that they were becoming this sort of elite and out of touch with the rest of the group. There was this sort of growing fear that ACT UP was, getting too close to the people in power. And because of that, they were worried that ACT UP might risk compromising on their morals and their core mission, to get certain things through. Yeah. There's a really incredible documentary called How to Survive a Plague by award-winning filmmaker David France. In that documentary, there was an activist and ACT UP member named, let's see if I can say their name correctly, Garance Frankie Ruda, I believe. She describes a meeting at which someone proposes a 6-month moratorium on meeting with drug companies.
I remember this very divisive moment where, there was a proposal for moratorium on meeting with drug companies, and someone for 6 months, and there was a huge and impassioned debate over it. And someone said, a woman who was not HIV positive said, "Well, it's not like it's for the rest of your life."
Oh.
And for a lot of people in the room, it was the rest of their life.
Right.
It was this very heated inflection point.
Yeah.
And after this, there were accusations of, threats and blackmail, and between members, general infighting started to spread. And ACT UP leadership ends up having a meeting at one point where Larry Kramer is in attendance, and they're trying to discuss sort of the infighting and what seems to be this growing difference in priorities. Some folks want to do this, other folks want to do this, and like, how do we prioritize those and what should we focus on more and that kind of thing?
The common enemy here, being AIDS, is now starting to become less of a priority, partly because of the size of the group. I don't know. I see that you have a clip here of Larry Kramer, and I'm curious to hear what he thinks.
Yeah, so here's a clip from that meeting. And the clip starts with not Larry Kramer, but it starts with one of the organizers of the meeting who is already addressing a member who has already made an outburst. And then Larry Kramer speaks up. And if you don't recognize his voice, you'll know when Larry Kramer comes in.
Plague! We are in the middle of a fucking plague! And you behave like this!
Wow, the room just went silent.
40 million infected people is a fucking plague!
Yeah.
We are in the worst shape we have ever been in.
Wow.
All those pills we're shoveling down our throats? Forget it. ACT UP has been taken over by a lunatic fringe. They can't get together. Nobody agrees with anything. All we can do is field a couple of hundred people at a demonstration. That's not going to make anybody pay attention.
Wow.
Not until we get millions out there. We can't do that. All we do is pick at each other and yell at each other. And I say to you in year 10, the same thing I said to you in 1981 when there were 41 cases. Until we get our acts together, all of us, we are as good as dead.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
That's really powerful.
I think that the thing that strikes me when listening to that is just the practicality that he has in mind, you know,
Right.
that he's not,
He's got a clear goal. He's got clear mission. Yeah.
well, and he like clearly, you know, he's the tone is kind of scolding for sure.
Oh, definitely.
But he's not saying that no one has a viewpoint that isn't important or that isn't worth considering. But what he is saying is that the issue is too big to let that small disagreement derail everything. Right?
I like the point that he made about 40 million infected and we only can get
a couple hundred for a demonstration.
100.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he has a point. And when I hear that, I think a lot about some of the community resource and community action groups here in Seattle in the trans community that I have attended in the last year. And there is every one of those that I go to, there's a lot of infighting, and it sounds very similar to this. And I think what Larry says right at the end, unless we get our acts together, we are as good as dead. And I think that applies today. And so every time I talk about how the younger community leaders who don't know their history, who don't know about things like ACT UP, those are the types of lessons that we're missing out on, that I think are directly applicable now, you know?
I just started transition and I've been on HRT for 2 months, and now it is the best time to speak on behalf of the entire trans community. That's what we see a lot. We see that a lot.
I've also seen, you know, the one group that I was referencing that you and I were both a part of, I distinctly remember when that group came together, the people that were organizing it kept talking about like they wanted a group that was democratic, that was effectively leaderless, so it had no sort of organizational structure. And then a big struggle that organization had was like they didn't know how to like organize and coordinate the people. And it's like, well, you're literally describing ACT UP. You're literally describing how ACT UP was organized. And they were the most effective AIDS advocacy group in the world, you know? So there's lots to learn there.
Yep. And like, I think, you know, the committees that of ACT UP, I think is a really awesome structural system that ACT UP utilized, because each and every, you know, like subgroup has their own ideas, motivations, issues, and each one of those things need to be addressed differently. Those subcommittees can be so useful when organizing, which isn't about, power dynamic, but about efficiency and making sure every single voice is heard. All the opinions are, being demonstrated in a respectful and appropriate way.
Right.
And if you just put a bunch of people into a room without any structure because you're afraid of a power dynamic establishing or something of the sorts, which is a valid concern, you need to recognize that there's also going to be problems with that as well. You can't just come into a room where every voice can be equal, but you have to have structure around that to make sure that every voice is heard.
Yeah. It also reminds me of when Larry described the organization of ACT UP being democratic to a fault. This is the fault. Mm-hmm. It's important to recognize that there does need to be some kind of leadership structure, but there are ways to do leadership that's not exclusionary or a authoritarian. There are ways to do that, but you still need to have some kind of leadership, because otherwise there are going to be a loud minority of voices that will drown out the others, and you need a way to sort of bring them in, because I think what we're seeing in this moment with ACT UP, and I think, what Larry saw both in this moment and earlier when he formed ACT UP, is that I don't think there's any such thing as a social issue that is simple enough that one, type of organization or solution can solve it, right?
Right.
I think that when you're talking about the nature of social issues like civil rights or healthcare or things like that, those problems impact so many people across so many industries and are controlled by so many, different mechanisms and levers that they always require a multifaceted solution. There will always be a need for multiple types of organizations to do multiple things to address one issue, because it needs to be, solved by coming at it from multiple directions, not just one. And so it's not that any one priority is wrong, but it is that maybe not just one organization can do all the priorities that need to be done.
Exactly.
In the end, it's the members of the Treatment and Data Committee, the group that was working most closely with policymakers and drug companies and government agencies. They decide to split off from ACT UP to form a new nonprofit organization that was called the Treatment Action Group, or TAG. And their goals were working with worldwide efforts to increase research on treatments for HIV. Mm-hmm. And they also wanted to increase access to already available treatments, treatments that were approved internationally, but not yet approved here. What are some ways that we can speed up the approval process so we can get them here, that kind of thing. So TAG was also a very important group as well. And like TAG, ACT UP spawned so many, outgrowth groups.
Right.
Those groups and ACT UP and TAG, those groups aren't dead. They continue to meet today, although with a lot less activity, I think, because, the government is now kind of involved in the issue, although that is probably going to change with the current political environment. I could see ACT UP and TAG and, these other outgrowths becoming more and more active as the current administration rolls back AIDS prevention programs and stuff like USAID, for instance. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it's so difficult to overstate the legacy that both Larry and ACT UP had. Larry recently passed away in 2020 at the age of 84, but, he was active until his death. He, spoke at numerous events, and not just about AIDS activism, but just queer activism in general. And, he was instrumental in helping multiple universities across the country create queer studies programs and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure that you can overstate how important Larry Kramer and ACT UP were in the legacy of the AIDS crisis and, the policy changes that came out of it. And Dr. Fauci has described Larry Kramer's legacy as, quote, in American medicine, there are two eras, before Larry and after Larry.
Wow.
I personally don't know what else to say about Larry and ACT UP. There's nothing else I can say about Larry and ACT UP that Dr. Fauci can't say better, so I'm just going to let him speak now.
The LGBT community, better than anyone that in my experience, were able to articulate an evidence-based plan of why we needed to put a lot of effort into addressing it. And the success is obvious when you look at where we are now with the drugs that we have and the prevention that we have. We have PrEP, we have lenacapavir, you could give it twice a year and have a 99 to 100% effectiveness in preventing acquisition. I mean, that didn't happen spontaneously. That happened because of the investment in basic and clinical biomedical research. I would hope not only the gay community, but I hope that all activists learn from the efficacy of what the gay community did back in the 80s and the 90s. Today, when we're having an anti-science flavor, we're having scientists attacked, we're having scientists try to be discredited. They're firing the best people at the CDC. We've withdrawn from the WHO. We're dismantling PEPFAR. We're degrading USAID. I believe that if the public looked back at what the gay community did in the 80s and 90s with advocacy, I think that this could have a major positive effect on turning around this anti-science, anti-global health approach that's coming from the highest levels today.
Do you know that poem? It's an old Welsh poem by poet Dylan Thomas. And in that poem, there's a line, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light."
I think so.
It's one of my favorite poems. And I think that's particularly prescient here. I think ACT UP sort of, is an example of that kind of raging. I mean, they took the mourning that came out of those early days of the AIDS crisis and really turned it into a, political momentum that showed the world what it means to rage against that dying of the light.
The machine. Right.
They had this fierce and unyielding love, burning in the darkness, trying to overcome the despair that, not just the queer community, but especially the queer community was experiencing during this moment. I think that their ACT UP is a great example for us to remember and learn from. And like we talked about in this episode, I think that there are a lot of lessons we can take from ACT UP and also, the organizations that we talked about in the last part that, by taking those lessons and applying them to our current struggles today, where I think that they are very applicable, if not more so than ever before, we keep that same love burning, in every protest, every zap, every clinic we go to, every time we refuse to hide who we are. It's ACT UP wasn't just fighting against death. They were fighting for life.
Right. I
think that we started this mini-series in kind of a very sort of depressing and dark note, talking about the politics. But I hope that over the last two episodes, we, are able to see that the best that came out of our community, we may have lost an entire generation in this crisis, and that's a wound that we still feel and carry today. But I think that out of that wound, we also gained a language of survival. Every banner that ACT UP raised, every poster that was printed, every vigil that they held,
every group that came out of it all.
Yeah. I think all of that echoes forward, and, we should mourn them, but not just mourn them. We should celebrate them. We should, carry their work forward in our own way with our own voices, and our own acts of
Defiance, yeah.
The struggle that was started long before us is obviously not over.
Never.
Not just, the AIDS pandemic isn't over, but neither is the fight for queer liberation, but their light, their inspiration, that's not over either.
We gotta fight for it.
For everyone listening, I think if you take anything from this mini series, my hope is that you take inspiration. AIDS itself may no longer be a death sentence, but the fight against AIDS and the fight for queer liberation is not over. So all of us, let's make sure we get out there and act up.
That was good, Dany. That was good.
If you like this episode, let us know. If you're listening on YouTube, leave a like, subscribe, drop a comment in the doobly-doo. If you're listening on Spotify, you can leave a comment there too. We actually got our first Spotify comment last week. So that was fun. But
that's exciting.
Definitely leave a comment. Let us know what you thought about the episode. If you want to listen to more, you can find more episodes wherever you get your podcasts or directly on our website at .fempodcast.com. If you really enjoy queer history and want to help us make this series and preserve these types of stories, you can support us financially by joining us over on Patreon, where you can also hear
listen to the whole interview with Dr. Fauci. Dany did such a good job, and I'm really proud of her.
There you go. And maybe even a commentary track for Larry Kramer's play turned into a movie in 2014, The Normal Heart.
Can we put the movie on a big screen and put ourselves in front of the screen and be little silhouettes like that?
Like MST3K? MST3
maybe?
gay?
Oh!
If you have suggestions for other queer histories you would like us to cover, please reach out. You can send us an email on our website using the form, or our address to our P.O. box is also there, so you can even send us a real life letter on actual physical fold-in papers.
Oh, right.
We definitely love hearing about everyone's local queer history stuff that, we never would know without all of your help and support. So definitely let us know so we can look into it and share those stories as well. So, and then finally, before we sign off, I just want to say to all of our listeners, thank you so much for this first year. This is the last episode of 2025. We're going to be taking a break for the holidays. It's before the holidays as we record this now, but this will be coming out, I believe, right before New Year's.
Yep.
So we're going to be taking a break for the holidays, and also so I can plan for the next year of episodes. But we will be back sometime probably in late February. I will try to be a lot better with my social media presence in 2026. So keep an eye on our Blue Sky for updates on when we'll return. It will be February, probably the end of that month, but definitely February. Thank you so much for listening. This is a great first year. I had a ton of fun doing all the research and recording this with you and putting it up. So
and we ended on such a high note. Dr. Fauci?
Yeah, it was great.
What?
So
that was great.
And with that, I'm going to say happy holidays and thank you so much. That's our episode, and we will see you in 2026.
Bye.